Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Alyssa Doroff. I'm the cyber technical leader here at NFP based in New York City. I'm very pleased to have Jamie Singer from Resolute Strategic Services here with me today. For those of you who may not be familiar with Resolute, they are a security and risk advisory firm that is comprised of trusted advisors that have worked on some of the most challenging international and domestic high-stakes security risk assessment assignments in the world. Resolute Strategic Services elite team advises C-suites and boards on security and geopolitical risks that shape the contours of the world and the impact on their enterprises. Resolute Cyber Strategies is part of Resolute Strategic Services and works closely with clients to provide guidance on internal and external cybersecurity communication strategies, stakeholder engagement, strategic messaging, media relations, and digital and social media engagement. I'm very excited to have Jamie here with us today, given the overwhelming amount of cybersecurity incidents we are seeing affecting businesses in all industry classes and revenue sectors. And I can personally speak from my own experience helping clients day in and day out through these ever increasing matters. One of the number one questions I get is, please put me in touch with a PR firm so I can tell my clients exactly what happened, as well as our employees. Jamie's going to talk to us today about when and why this is a good idea, and more importantly, not a good idea. But at best, how to communicate this message in the midst of a cybersecurity crisis and what exactly this should contain. Now, a bit about Jamie. Jamie Singer is an Executive Vice President and Director of Data Security, Privacy, and Crisis Communications at Resolute Strategic Services. Jamie leads Resolute's Cyber Strategies Group, which works with organizations in a range of sectors on reputation management and strategic communications before, during, and after significant cyber threats and incidents. Jamie came to Resolute from Edelman, the global communications firm, where for 7 years she led their U.S. data security and privacy group. Through her time at Edelman and Resolute, Jamie has counseled on strategic communications responses for hundreds of significant data security and privacy issues, from complicated ransomware issues to business email compromises to third-party breaches. Jamie's team works closely with leading cyber insurance carriers, cyber attorneys, and IT forensics firms as part of a company's holistic response to a significant security event. Before we get started, just a quick note on logistics. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll either answer them as they become relevant throughout the presentation or at the end. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie to get started.
Thanks, Alyssa. Great to be here and to have this discussion on this important topic today. There's a lot of focus today on the operational, financial, and legal consequences of cybersecurity issues, and with good reason. But the potential reputational impacts of these incidents should not be overlooked. After all, your reputation is, at the end of the day, your greatest asset as a company. So today I'm looking forward to sharing some insights into a few key areas. First, we'll examine today's evolving cybersecurity landscape from a reputational risk lens. Then I'll share some do's and don'ts of cyber crisis communications based on my experience over the years, as well as some recent case studies. And finally, we'll discuss how companies can best prepare for these issues from a strategic communications perspective before that crisis hits. So it's no secret that the cyber threat landscape has continued to intensify today in terms of the volume, sophistication, and impact of attacks. No company or industry is immune today, from healthcare to higher education, to professional services firms, to municipalities, to even critical infrastructure, as we've all been reading in the news headlines. What makes this environment even more dynamic for companies is not only do you need to think about your own security risk, but also the security vulnerabilities of your partners, your vendors, your suppliers, as supply chain attacks have surged by 42% from the last quarter of 2020 to the first quarter of this year. And we've all seen notable incidents involving SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange, and others. We're also seeing threat actor tactics continuing to evolve, and that's putting increased reputational pressure on organizations. Ransomware, of course, remains a priority threat. What makes ransomware so damaging from a reputational perspective is it essentially packs a 1-2 punch. Not only do organizations need to communicate with their employees and customers about potentially prolonged operational disruption, but 3/4 of ransomware attacks now involve the threat to leak exfiltrated data. So this means businesses need to contend with stakeholder concerns around the privacy of their confidential information being exposed and the potential legal notification requirements that accompany many of these incidents. The regulatory and legal landscape around these issues also continues to be top of mind as we're seeing continued class action litigation following major breaches, as well as regulatory fines in the wake of poor corporate responses. Finally, it's clear that the COVID-19 environment has accelerated digital transformation across industries. We're especially seeing that in sectors like healthcare and banking. And while this transformation, of course, is very exciting, it also brings increased reputational risk around how companies are protecting the security and privacy of the data entrusted to them, and how consumers are challenging organizations around issues of data privacy and usage. What do these trends in the cyber landscape mean for organizations' public exposure? Well, as you can see from the sampling of recent media headlines, these issues are creating increased pressure on brands' public profiles. For one, there is increased media interest around the double extortion tactics involved in ransomware. Data leaks, payment decisions, ransomware payments in the tens of millions of dollars, those are all very sexy stories in the eyes of reporters. We've also seen quite a few media headlines around major third-party breaches this year, from SolarWinds to Excellion. Not only are media covering these organizations, but they're also covering those businesses that were affected by the downstream impacts. Media are essentially judging you by the company that you keep. So while there is some breach fatigue out there, media are continuing to find interesting and compelling story angles that are keeping companies in the limelight, much to their chagrin. But make no mistake, reputational risk from cyber incidents does not only manifest itself in negative news headlines. Cybersecurity isn't just a so-called PR problem. It can be a major reputational challenge with the potential to impact companies' bottom lines. For example, there's a new study that looked at the 100 largest cyber loss events over the past 5 years that found the median total incident costs were more than 2.5 times greater for those companies that had clear issues or challenges in their communications response. Issues like being too slow to respond, covering up information, or repeatedly changing their story or message. There also continues to be clear data on the impacts of these issues on stakeholder perceptions and trust. Consumers are using their purchasing power to either punish or reward organizations based on if they've had a cyber breach or not. And according to Ponemon Institute, lost business, which includes customer turnover, lost revenue, and the increased cost of acquiring new business as a result of reputational impacts, is the single largest cost factor in a data breach. This is the bad news. The good news is many organizations are beginning to recognize the significant reputational risks that accompany data security issues. According to a new survey conducted by Wakefield of security and risk leaders at organizations with more than 500 million in revenue, the top concern that security leaders reported regarding negative impacts from a cyber attack was actually reputation, even more so than operational disruption or even legal and regulatory concerns. But unfortunately, there's still a paradox. This same study found that half of organizations said they lacked clearly defined communications processes to respond to these issues. And communications is essential for effective reputation management. So what I'd like to focus on during the majority of our time today is how to address that disconnect, how to prepare your organizations to communicate effectively in the wake of a significant cybersecurity incident in order to protect and possibly even enhance your corporate reputation. So you've been hacked. Now what? What do you say? How much do you say? To whom do you say it? When do you say it? There's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all to the so-called cybersecurity communications playbook. The scope of the specific issue, the nature of the attack, the visibility of your brand, and a company's typical communications posture are all going to impact your communications and messaging strategy. But on the subsequent slides, I'll share a few best practices that seem to consistently ring true from my experience guiding organizations who are confronting major cybersecurity incidents. Number one, legal, regulatory, and communication strategies must work in lockstep. There's an age-old misconception that lawyers and PR people like myself can't get along. But when it comes to cybersecurity communications, they need to be best friends, or at least that's my approach. As you know, data breach communications are often accompanied by very specific legal notification requirements dictating how and when a company must disclose an incident impacting PII or PHI. So it's critical that the communications team understands what those requirements are relevant to a particular issue. Key questions to ask right away include, when is the notification deadline? Are we only sending notification letters or is substitute notice required on our corporate website? Do we need to provide proactive notice to media? In which markets? Does the notice need to only go to media or does it need to be placed in an outlet as an ad? This is why it's so important to ensure legal, forensics, and communication strategies are aligned from the outset of an issue and not attempting to operate in silos. The regulatory enforcement landscape also continues to evolve with GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act as a few examples that are putting increased pressure on companies to communicate quickly and effectively. It's important to be prepared for regulators and elected officials to scrutinize your communications response. For example, when the Capital One breach was announced, the very first tweet that gained any traction was from an elected official that was using the breach as a talking point for legislation that was on the table. As another recent example, Colonial Pipeline CEO is now going to need to testify on Capitol Hill, in part because of his recent interview with the Wall Street Journal regarding the company's decision to pay the ransom. So understanding the propensity for scrutiny and attention from AG offices on the state level to regulators on the national level is a critical part of your communications planning. Interestingly enough, these regulators can sometimes be sources of leaks to media. So relationship building before that crisis hits is also critical to mitigate those potential risks. Given the potential for all this legal and regulatory scrutiny, it's critical from a messaging standpoint to stick to the facts and not speculate when you don't know the answer. 2, the early bird doesn't always catch the worm. Typical crisis management 101 is to communicate as quickly as possible when you know you have a crisis. But in cybersecurity communications, that's not always best practice. While the initial instinct may be to communicate immediately and openly, it's also important that this urgency is balanced with getting the facts right and not going down into rabbit holes companies frankly don't want to be in. So while it's of course important to make sure you're meeting any legal disclosure requirements as outlined by counsel, communicating too quickly before you have all the information or before your systems are remediated or the threat is contained can actually open up your organization to more reputational risk. One of the classic case studies in how not to communicate during a cybersecurity incident is the Target breach. You may remember Target's CEO had to state and restate again the number of impacted customers in that incident, which only further eroded customer trust and kept that company in the media headlines. The reason this happened is because facts are very fluid in a forensic investigation. These investigations take time to complete and often uncover additional information along the way. So it's critical not to put out into the public domain information that could potentially change and have the risk of having to correct that, which is going to undermine trust. In my experience, stakeholders will often forgive you for being too slow to respond, but not for being wrong. In an ideal scenario, best practice is to wait until the forensic investigation is concluded before you communicate externally, when you know the full scope of the issue, who is impacted, what information is involved, and how you're going to address it and support impacted individuals, such as are you offering credit monitoring and establishing a call center. Of course, oftentimes companies' hands are being forced to communicate early due to the nature of the attack. For example, in ransomware, when there's an immediate operational disruption that you need to communicate about, or if there's a public leak or a media scoop. So in those scenarios, it's important to communicate something so your stakeholders know you're taking the issue seriously and are on top of it, but also not communicate too much or ahead of the fact pattern in a way that might compromise negotiations or the ongoing investigation. 3, take the oxygen out of the media fire. The cybersecurity media landscape is pretty unique in that it continues to be dominated by several high-profile, widely trusted, plugged-in security reporters that are very influential in the cyber community and often are connected to sources that regularly scan the dark web. Brian Krebs of Krebs on Security and Zach Whitaker at TechCrunch are a few of the more prominent examples. There's a typical cadence to the cybersecurity news cycle we see when a company discloses an issue. Typically, the cyber trades are often the ones to report first, and their coverage is what's typically picked up by local and potentially national news media. National media are typically mostly interested in these issues if they involve high profile brands or if there's a significant number of impacted individuals involved. And then, frankly, after a week or two, most media will typically move on to the next breach. There is that degree of breach fatigue out there, given the frequency of these events being reported on each day. Most victim organizations quickly become a talking point or an example for broader trend stories on cybersecurity threats in a particular industry or on a particular threat actor tactic. So, in some ways, you want to play into this breach fatigue. And one of those ways is by making your announcement as transactional as possible. So rather than have your executives pursue live media interviews and run the risk of easily falling into rabbit holes of difficult questions, I will often instead recommend that organizations use written statements, which have a much better chance of controlling and maintaining consistency of message. Of course, the media are going to press you for more information, more details, more specifics, like the number of impacted individuals. Was there a ransom? Did you pay? Why or why not? When are your systems going to be fully restored? It is their job to ask these difficult and often annoying questions. But you don't have to take the media bait necessarily. You can lean on the ongoing nature of the investigation, for example. So it's helpful to think through those so-called if press statements before you have an issue. At the end of the day, media relations during an active cybersecurity event is often a situation where less is more. Real-time media and social media monitoring is an important tool to see how your message is playing in coverage. Is it resonating or not? Is volume of coverage increasing or decreasing? Are there misconceptions being propagated that need to be corrected? Are influencers carrying the conversation, or is there just a lot of noise? All this data can help to inform and calibrate your communication strategy accordingly. 4, impacted individuals are the North Star of your communications plan. While there's often a lot of concern about how to manage the media in these situations, media is not your most important audience. Media should really be viewed as a conduit to your most important audiences, which are your impacted customers or consumers. Messaging to these audiences should be focused on the facts of the incident, the steps you are taking to address it, and how you're supporting them as impacted individuals. It's important to demonstrate the right level of compassion and transparency to these audiences to the extent possible. You want to acknowledge their concern and frustration and how you're going to earn trust. It's also helpful to prioritize your stakeholders. Take a look at your top customers or your top donors, for example. Those are the folks you might want to do a little more high-touch communications with before they get that form notification letter in the mail. Honestly, in my experience, sometimes stakeholders just want a human face to yell at in these situations. And so setting up a phone call or a meeting can go a long way to re-earning trust. Besides customers, you also don't want to neglect your other key stakeholders, your vendors, your partners, elected officials. You want to make sure you have developed a multi-stakeholder communications plan. One important aspect of stakeholder communications today is contemplating your social media strategy in the middle of a cybersecurity incident. Especially for consumer-facing organizations, social media will often be the vehicle for impacted consumers to vent their frustration. Best practice social media guidance in these situations is to try to take that conversation offline to the extent possible through either direct messages or private messages, and refer folks to the proper resources like the website or call center for more information. At the same time, social media can also be a powerful proactive communications tool, especially for those organizations whose typical communications channels might be down in a ransomware event, for example. Your phone, your website, your email might be down. So in fact, I actually recently worked with a major university down south who was facing a ransomware incident that knocked their website and phone system offline. So the university used their social media properties to communicate important restoration updates to the campus community until their website was back up. This was a great and effective way to reach students, faculty, and employees and others in their cybersecurity incident. 5, employees are your most credible spokespersons. Keep them informed. Many organizations neglect to prioritize employee communications in these situations, and this is often a missed opportunity to inform and arm your biggest advocates. At the end of the day, employees are the ones that are largely interfacing with your customers. So it's critical to equip everyone from your board to your management team to even your frontline reception staff with the proper communications guidance, including what to say and, more importantly, what not to say and how to escalate difficult questions. Of course, at the same time, employees present a communications risk in that they are often the sources of leaks and anonymous quotes to media. So it's important to reference and reinforce your media and social media policies with your employees so you don't have rogue employees talking out of turn. What's also interesting about employees is that they often wear two hats in these incidents, as they may be impacted by the security incident themselves. Their ability to do their work might be disrupted in a ransomware situation, or their personal data could be compromised. So you want to make sure you're demonstrating the appropriate level of compassion and authentic communications to your employees. I'm working with a major hospital system right now facing a cybersecurity challenge, and they have a very dynamic CEO who's used to being out there talking to employees on a variety of issues. It was very important to him and the board to make sure he was visible to employees during this active cybersecurity incident. So in this case, we've been using a combination of video messages, employee memos, and having the CEO walk the halls to really show that high touch communications and engagement. That's just one example. Finally, you should assume that everything you say internally could leak externally. In some instances, you can use that knowledge to your advantage and craft employee communications with the hope that they end up in media's hands if there's a particular message you might want to seed with media. 6, message discipline is paramount. It's important to adopt a very careful, thoughtful, and consistent approach to messaging in these matters because every word really counts. For example, the moment you say the word ransomware, this will open you up to difficult questions regarding payment decisions and payment amounts, which honestly do not advantage an organization to try to answer, especially in the middle of an investigation. Now, this is not to say there isn't a scenario where you may want to be more forthright about ransomware, for example. We've been seeing this with Colonial Pipeline. But it's important to be mindful of how just one word can open up a large can of worms, and you need to be prepared for that. A few other phrases I would suggest avoiding when it comes to messaging in these situations. High blood pressure words like hacker, attack, stolen, nation state, foreign, all those buzzwords can often cause unnecessary alarm and concern in the eyes of your stakeholders. Similarly, you actually want to stay away from the word breach or data breach. Breach is a legally defined word that differs from state to state based on their specific breach notification laws. Plus, not all security incidents are data breaches. Some ransomware incidents, for example, do not end up involving data access or exfiltration. So a safer route is often to refer to these matters in a more high-level manner like incident, cybersecurity incident, security incident, etc. You also want to make sure you're avoiding self-victimization language or expressing sentiment that this is very hard on you as a company. At the end of the day, your customers, your employees feel that they are the true victims. And so by using the victim word yourself, you may end up inadvertently putting your important stakeholders in a defensive or reactionary posture. But as I mentioned at the top, this is general best practice guidance. For some organizations, more transparency in their messaging may be necessary. We saw this with FireEye. FireEye's security incident could certainly have spelled reputational disaster, given they're one of the nation's leading cybersecurity companies. They ended up receiving significant praise from media and prominent elected officials for their decision to proactively self-disclose the incident and transparently share important information with law enforcement, the intelligence community, and security partners, even though they weren't under a legal mandate to do so. So in that case, the perspective of stakeholder trust, the nature of the brand certainly came to bear on FireEye's messaging approach. 7, be prepared to be nimble in ransomware communications. It's critical today that every organization have a scenario plan in place for ransomware. As we've discussed, this is a highly evolving space with increasing reputational risks stemming from both operational disruption and the ability to serve customers, not to mention the high potential for data exfiltration and data leaks. So this means there are particular communications nuances that are a bit different from your straightforward business email compromise. A few examples. One, given the operational disruption often associated with these incidents, in these cases, more immediate communications with your employees and potentially external audiences is important because you're going to need to communicate workarounds, manual processes, and potentially even alternate avenues to communicate with your organization if your email, phone, and/or website are down. Given restoration timelines are often very opaque in these situations, it's important to establish a somewhat regular cadence of communications with your stakeholders to demonstrate incremental progress and thank your stakeholders for their patience and support throughout this process. But at the same time, you want to be careful and not overpromise on restoration timelines or when things are going to be fully back up. In my experience, it's almost always better to underpromise and overdeliver in these situations. Ransomware investigations are a long game, and so again, you want to prepare accordingly for additional escalations, including data exfil, data leaks, and potential notification requirements. But probably the most difficult communications decision in ransomware situations is how transparent to be about the ransomware aspect. I will share that I've had clients really go across the spectrum of transparency in their messaging. I've worked with a retailer that referred to it as a network outage the entire time in their communications plan on the one hand, and then you have Colonial Pipeline on the other hand, who's gone so far as to disclose the amount of the ransomware payment and why they paid it. This is again one of those one size does not fit all decisions. There are risks of transparently coming out with this information too soon, and there are risks of not. Communicating too openly about ransomware in the middle of a negotiation could impact that negotiation. But not being transparent enough could irritate your customers and employees with potential impacts on trust. So I'm often working with companies to find that middle ground messaging approach where you're providing an appropriate level of transparency during these incidents, but not creating additional reputational risk for these organizations. These are exactly the types of discussions that I would encourage you to have not only among your communications teams, but your leadership teams before you're faced with this difficult situation, so you're not making it up on the fly. 8, demonstrate a bias toward action. Cyber attacks are not business as usual, and it's important for organizations to communicate how seriously they are taking these issues. In the short term, this could mean identifying the steps the organization took to contain the incident, what you're doing to investigate the matter, and the types of third-party experts you've brought in to assist you. In the long term, it's also important to communicate how your organization is going to enhance security moving forward. How are you improving and enhancing your security protocols, your processes, your employee education and training to try to prevent something like this from occurring again? At the same time, you don't want to give too much detail into what you're doing from a security enhancement perspective because you don't want to tip off the threat actors. Now, a good way to show stakeholders you're not taking this issue seriously is by tweeting the next day after you disclose a cyber incident about how great your products are as if nothing has occurred. And I've certainly had clients do that. And so that's why it's critical to take a look at your unrelated proactive marketing and advertising calendars to identify those proactive communications that you might want to table or postpone to let the cybersecurity issue breathe on its own. At the end of the day, all you want to do is not create more fodder for stakeholder angst. 9, scenario plan for multiple potential outcomes. Unfortunately, your work does not end the day you announce a security incident. These matters tend to evolve and escalate. As we've discussed, this is especially true in ransomware with scenarios involving data exfiltration, data leaks, prolonged operational disruption, and potential DDoS attacks. So as you focus on near-term communications triage needs, it's also important to have an eye toward the longer term and scenario plan accordingly. For example, you should be thinking about potential scenarios that might involve class action litigation or congressional scrutiny and more. As one example, I'm currently working with a major retailer who several months ago was hit with ransomware. At the time, they were very much able to fly under the radar externally and with media because they were able to restore their operations very quickly. There was not a lot of customer impact, and the data impacted was internal information only. However, this threat actor that targeted them is currently back in the news. And now some media have been rescanning that threat actor's leak site and making the connection to my client. This is 3 months after the fact. And that has essentially reopened our leak playbook. So the lesson in all of this is don't get complacent with your communications scenario planning. And 10, pivot toward reputation recovery. Throughout the course of an incident, it's important to be using hard data and metrics to guide your organization in seeing how the incident is or is not impacting your corporate reputation and what that might mean for your ongoing communication strategies. Key metrics you should be looking at from a reputational perspective include media and social media conversation, the volume of that conversation, the sentiment, the velocity, customer surveys, sales data, employee engagement data, etc. Your go-forward communication strategies based on those metrics may include finding appropriate moments to be a little more proactive with media, or potentially leveraging third-party experts on joint pieces of thought leadership or legislative efforts on these important issues. I'm even working with a school district right now following a ransomware incident who's now working to engage with their students directly who are interested in helping this school district enhance their IT security, including login and password rules. And so that's a great way that they've engaged their audiences after an incident. Now, of course, this might not be appropriate for every organization and every matter. Not every company needs a reputation recovery campaign after a security incident, but every organization should be thinking about how and when they will talk about data security and privacy moving forward. Now, the reality is it is no longer a matter of if, but when any organization is bound to face a cybersecurity event. All organizations have an opportunity to take the time now to invest in proactive communications planning. This will save you money, it will save you resources, and will enable you to communicate more quickly and effectively than when emotions, frankly, are running very high in the middle of a security incident. So what are the cornerstones of effective communications preparedness programs? Well, a critical first step is enhancing your communications preparedness is identifying and assessing your reputational risk. So what this means is looking at your organization's unique data security and privacy threats and thinking how those would impact your corporate reputation. You want to understand how prepared you are to respond to those threats and take a look to see, do you have proper incident response plans, crisis communications plans, emergency protocols in place right now, or are there gaps? This assessment process may also involve having very open and honest conversations with your incident response team and leadership team to find out what keeps them up at night. That's where you really want to hone your communications planning. You also want to take a deep dive into your existing crisis communications plans and protocols to see if these are actually actionable tools that you can use in a crisis situation, or if they're 100-page manuals that are just collecting dust on a shelf and therefore not usable. This assessment work is going to help to inform your organization's crisis communications plan and protocols. Best practice plans typically contain general response guidelines and protocols that you can use no matter the security incident. You want to think through in advance who would sit on your communications response team. What are their different roles and responsibilities? Who has ultimate decision-making authority and approval authority on messaging and communications, and who could be their backup if and when they're unavailable? You want to make sure your plans have key contact lists, as well as general internal and external communications response protocols. But in my experience, in order to make these crisis communications truly actionable, they need to focus heavily on scenario planning. This means contemplating in advance what your communications approaches and your messaging would be for specific risk areas and threats that you've identified in your assessment process. My recommendation today is every organization should have scenario communications plans in place for 1, business email compromises that expose PII or PHI, 2, ransomware attacks and their various escalations, and 3, third-party breaches that could impact your organization. So what this means is drafting in advance what your media holding statement would be if you were hit with ransomware today. Plot out those tough Q&As, the questions that you know you're going to get. How many people are impacted? When are you going to restore? Did you pay? Why or why not? So this way you at least have a starting point to work from when you're faced with the real thing. And nowadays, it's also important to think about how you will maintain 24/7 access to your critical response plans and communications protocols, especially if you're hit with ransomware and certain files or systems or email could be encrypted. So you want to make sure you have good old-fashioned paper copies available and potentially explore digital apps where you could store your incident response plans in an offline way. Now, it's all and good to have these crisis communications plans and protocols documented on a page. But if they are not tested, if your communications teams are not trained, then these plans will just collect dust on a shelf. So it's important to be going through simulated scenarios to test your response teams and leadership teams, both on their decision making and their communications process in the wake of these incidents. These exercises should not only incorporate the important technical aspects and technical escalations of cyber attacks, but also the reputational ones. For example, what would you as an organization do if media called you in the middle of an investigation? How would you handle a social media firestorm on Facebook? What if your internal call center was overrun with customer inquiries? Tabletop or crisis simulation exercises can help to expose potential gaps in your ability to answer those questions in a controlled environment. And these exercises will help your teams to build the muscle memory they need to be effective in communications responses. Now, these exercises should not only involve your internal teams, but I would also recommend including your outside partners, your cyber counsel, cyber insurance companies, forensics firms, communications firms. You essentially want to simulate an environment where you have all the players at the table who would be there for the real thing. I would also highly recommend that members of executive leadership participate in these exercises. A few years ago, I was working with a major online payments company doing a C-suite simulation on a ransomware incident. And before the exercise, the CEO pronounced to everybody he would never pay a ransom. No way, no how. We're then going through the exercise. We throw very difficult escalations at this company and the leadership team. And guess what? Of course, they ultimately decided to pay. In the debrief session after the exercise, the CEO said to us he would never have known that this was the decision-making process his team would have made if it weren't for going through this fictitious yet realistic scenario. Looking ahead, communications preparedness is likely to only take on increasing importance as part of incident response planning. Now, you don't only need to take my word for it as a PR professional. We're actually seeing the current regulatory and legislative pressure and momentum around these topics, both on the state and federal levels when it comes to calls for greater transparency and information sharing, and even quicker notification deadlines and disclosure requirements, as we saw outlined in President Biden's recent executive order. There are also cost savings reasons to invest in communications preparedness and trainings. According to the Ponemon Institute, companies that tested their incident response plans and communications plans using those tabletop exercises I mentioned are saving in the area of $2 million compared to those companies that had no such measures, no such trainings in place. So at the end of the day, cybersecurity communications preparedness must have a seat at the incident response planning table. To summarize, here are a few key takeaways that encourage you to bring back to your organization. For one, these issues are inevitable for every organization in every sector. Wishful thinking that this won't happen to you is not a proper preparedness plan. Two, take the time now to invest in proactive communications preparedness. Assess your reputational risk and communications posture, and then develop robust communications and scenario plans for these risk areas, and then go ahead and test those plans in a simulation exercises. As a follow-up to this webinar, we're actually going to provide you with free access to Resolute's cybersecurity app, which includes a vulnerability self-assessment that your organization can take now to assess your level of readiness. And it also includes links to other helpful educational resources. Feel free to scan this QR code on the slide right now so you can download it immediately. Just hold your device up to the screen, use your camera to capture the QR code, and that'll take you to a link where you can install it. we have the enter this code here. And again, we'll be providing this information in a follow-up email as well. And finally, I'd encourage you to establish relationships with key partners in advance of an issue. Cyber insurance, legal, IT forensics, and your strategic communications partners. While you hope you never have to call these people, it's good to know who they are before they do. With that, Alyssa, happy to take any questions.
That's great. Jamie, thank you so much. That was so much really informative information and really, really helpful. And it's so funny because I was taking notes and we do have a question, but I had a question, but I think you already answered it. And my question was this, so many times I get asked by so many companies that don't have a pretty sophisticated IT structure and or the budget to really invest heavily in doing everything they can to be as prepared, for any type of cybersecurity incident. And the number one thing I always say is at least have your decision makers lined up. If you do have an incident, have these established relationships ahead of time in place. For PR and working with you guys, how does this process typically work? Does it involve a law firm that needs to retain you? Obviously, if there's an incident, that's one type of situation, and maybe you can speak to each. But ahead of time, can they just reach out to you for a $0 retainer or SLA, something along those lines? Logistically, kind of how does that work? Because PR is oftentimes the last step, and it shouldn't be. And I guess I'm just trying to understand from your extensive experience, really, what are your recommendations in that regard?
Yeah, great question. So on the incident response side, in terms of our engagement, as you mentioned, typically we are retained by outside cyber counsel to help protect privilege. So we typically structure engagements through a tri-party agreement. And so I would encourage organizations that are facing a live incident to work with their cyber insurance carrier and outside counsel to retain a crisis communications or strategic communications firm. Now, on the front end, absolutely can and would love to establish these relationships on the front end directly. They don't necessarily need to involve outside counsel, though certainly they can. And typically those relationships, as you said, Alyssa, we may not bill anything until there's an issue, but it's just to sort of get more comfortable with each other, learn the brand, potentially start to work together on those reputational risk assessments and communications preparedness audits. I would also prefer to sort of look at companies' incident response plans and communications plans in advance. So at least we know where we're starting from before there's an issue. So essentially, we work with companies sort of on a variety of levels, can scale up, can scale down, can just be available for a gut check, an assessment, or work with you on a full scale communications planning simulation exercise. So, we're flexible. And again, the app is a great way, a free tool to sort of get familiar with some of these resources. There's also a button there to call us if you do have an urgent issue. So, happy to have any of those conversations. And I agree with you, Alyssa, it's often an afterthought to think about communications. And as hopefully I conveyed today, this is becoming more and more essential and critical to overall reputation management. So I would encourage companies not to wait for the crisis before they start establishing these relationships.
That's great, Jamie. That's super helpful. We had a question come in that says, how do we find a company that we can hire and trust to probe our company's defenses and identify weaknesses? So this is a pretty open-ended question. I'm going to take it. So a lot of times in this regard, you would probably want to look to a cybersecurity firm. On the proactive side, these are typically thought of incident response firms and or forensics firms. But here, I think the best thing, reach out to myself or any of your NFP cyber representatives or brokers. We'd be happy to help you make recommendations in this regard that can put you in touch with some resources at discounted rates that can kind of help you understand, where you are as compared to your peers. Do you have, the basics that you need to have in place as far as your cybersecurity controls and procedures, depending on your industry class, your potential regulatory requirements, and a number of other factors that would make these determinations. There's certainly more comprehensive risk assessments that can take place, red team, blue team exercises, several types of testing and vulnerability scanning and probing that can be done to help a company understand these defenses and weaknesses. More importantly, weaknesses and how they can defend themselves, or really be on the offensive. But it really depends on the budget, the nature of the company and the industry class, and so on and so forth. So I'd say that is, those are some resources we would be we would be happy to help you find. Um, I have, Jamie, just another question because, I'm dealing with companies, like I said at the beginning, in all revenue sizes and all, industry classes, kind of in terms of a lot of times, like I said, they want to jump to get a PR message out. And I know you said this repeatedly. We saw it with Target, we saw it with Equifax. And, a lot of times companies say, I really I want to let everybody know that they can trust us, they can rely on us, they really, our brand valuation shouldn't suffer. And again, I know you kind of said this throughout the presentation, but very simply stated, what is the ultimate communication, if there is to be any, if a company is so hard pressed that they want to get something out and they don't know what's happened? It's forensic investigation has just started. They potentially have been hit with a ransomware demand. They don't know if they need to pay it. What are just some literally like 2 sentences, or what should they say to their business partners, to their employees, and should this message differ?
Yeah, great question. And these are exactly the holding statements, I would encourage companies to be thinking about right now. So I would say there's typically three elements to sort of that high level initial communication or statement. The first is some sort of acknowledgement that the organization is aware of a potential security incident or network incident or some high level description like that. The second element is focusing on a description of what your organization is doing to investigate or respond to it. So, high level message on steps you're taking to contain the incident, to investigate, that you've engaged a third party independent cybersecurity firm to assist you, potentially that you've notified law enforcement. And then, third, a commitment to providing updates as appropriate, but also noting that the investigation is ongoing. So those are sort of the typical, I'd say, kind of boilerplate, high level messaging when a company feels like they need to say something, as well as reiterating, the importance of network security, information security to that organization. In terms of your question about, does the message differ externally or internally? At the end of the day, the core message should be very consistent. You want to have that well-balanced narrative out there. But internally, you also want to be thinking through what are those reminders you want to give to employees, again, about how to escalate questions. If we do want them answering questions, how should they do it? Reminding them what to do if they got immediate inquiry, and sort of having that rallying cry for the organization about thanking, folks internally for their support, their patience, their dedication, having a little bit more of an emotional message internally, because you're really going to need your folks to rally around this issue.
That's great, Jamie. That's all super helpful. We actually have some more questions that have come in. Actually, we have a lot. Okay, so let me take each one in turn. We got a question as to whether carriers are offering premium credit for having plans in place for cybersecurity, or will plans enable an account to be written in this hard market? Are there any standards for these plans? That is a really good question. There's a number of different plans that we're talking about here. I'm going to say, very generally speaking, carriers are going to expect at a minimum that you have a business continuity and or an incident response plan. And within that business continuity or incident response plan, there should be a crisis communication plan. And Jamie, correct me if I'm wrong, but typically that would be where your messaging and guidance would ideally be anticipated within that IR plan and or business continuity plan, and understanding what that communications message should be at the escalation process and who's going to convey that message. Please, correct me if I'm missing anything there.
No, that's right. I mean, often what I'll see in incident response plans is one line about refer to communications plan, and that may or may not have been developed. So to your point, Alyssa, either having that messaging or guidance baked into the IR plan, or having a companion piece that the communications response team can consult.
That's great. And the other question was, whether they would receive premium credits for that. Unfortunately, in this hard market, the answer is definitely no. It's kind of the expectation that you have that in place just to be able to procure the insurance in the first place. This, answer has changed dramatically over the last few years, where you might have seen some premium relief for really having excellent security controls and procedures in place. But now there are just such minimum standards in light of what the carriers are seeing with ransomware and losses overall, that, it really is expected that they have at a minimum, these communications and these business continuity plans in place. Even if they're not a sophisticated entity, at a minimum, they should have, a business continuity plan and escalation process in terms of knowing, if something happens, who gets notified and how that message gets, to their carrier if they have cyber liability insurance, and alternatively, if not, to the law firm, and how the law firm can escalate that to potentially the incident response and or PR firm. We have two more questions. The next question is, do you have guidelines for basic cybersecurity requirement guidelines that will need to be met to obtain a cybersecurity policy? Our clients are seeing more detailed. Yes, by all means, the cybersecurity market, as has been said, has hardened dramatically. There are a number of questions that have been added over the last few years in terms of regulatory compliance, as far as the type of information that's being stored by a company. If that's biometric information, if that needs to be in compliance with California's consumer privacy statute, if that needs to be in compliance with the EU's global data protective regulation. So it definitely depends as far as whether we have guidelines for basic cybersecurity requirements to obtain a policy. Like I said, it certainly depends on the type of company, the regulatory requirements, and what they're seeing. Please reach out to me independently, and I can put you in touch with a member of our team that can send you a basic application from one of the major carriers that would give you the minimum guidelines that would need to be met. Those questions will all have to be answered. I can't say that there's basic requirements. There are a number of requirements. Multi-factor authentication is one, extremely, extremely basic, yet many companies on the smaller side do not have this. A number of other things as far as security controls and procedures that do need to be in place, having an incident response plan. But again, happy to talk offline as pertains to that question, because that is highly dependent on the industry as far as, again, regulatory requirements, what their security controls and procedures look like right now, and the level that they would need to be in order to qualify for insurance coverage in the first place. We have another question. Is there a template for the 3 types of scenarios mentioned? Data, email breach, ransomware, partner incidents that we could use to develop our own communications and messaging plans. Jamie, I'm going to defer to you in that regard. Obviously not expecting you to give out your secret sauce for free, but if there is some basic guidance that you can provide, be happy to have you share that after this presentation. And also, like I said, we're happy to partner with Resolute. Resolute will offer us, steeply discounted rates to help you and your team put this communication message together so that you are best prepared.
Yeah, absolutely, Alyssa. Happy to work with organizations on the messaging. What I will say in terms of the format or templates for these scenario plans that I think are most helpful and actionable in a real incident is for each of these 3, to go through what are those key questions you should ask your incident response team that would inform the communications plan for each of these. Then I would also have what that media holding statement would look like. Again, that 3 or 4 sentence blocking statement, even if you have some placeholders in there for details, but start to document that. And then I'd have a list of the 5 or 10 tough Q&As that you're going to get in an email compromise situation or a ransomware situation, and document that. And again, some of this messaging will look similar across these 3 scenarios. For example, again, you always want to share what you know in terms of the facts, share what you're doing to demonstrate that bias toward action, reinforce a commitment to information security and privacy, but some of the nuances will be particular, as you've identified here for ransomware.
That's great. Somebody asked me personally I don't know if you wanted my contact information or Jamie's contact information, but I know Leanne, who has facilitated our presentation here today, will gladly share as a follow-up the QR code that Jamie recommended for their app, and Jamie's contact information and my contact information will be in there as well. Okay, great. Well, it looks like we've answered all of our questions. Again, I really want to thank Jamie for that excellent presentation. It's just so nice for a change to have a PR firm really talk to us about the communication, because there's so much ambiguity and confusion. I think when companies are in the midst of a crisis, really rushing to get a message out that is only going to hurt them and cause potential third-party litigation and regulatory inquiries on the back end. So thank you, Jamie, again. As I mentioned, reach out to myself or Jamie. Our contact information will be in the information following this, for additional resources and how we can help. And with that said, I'm going to close it out and thank everybody again, and just also let you all know that there'll be a recording of today's presentation that will be available in 48 hours. So we will send that as well. So thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.